How you doing, buddy? How's everything? It's been a long time since we last spoke.
It's been a long time. It's been a very long time. I remember that day in Central Park in 2008. It was like the first week of June 2008.
Yeah.
Brandon J. It feels like a lifetime ago. I think in fact, nothing says lifetime ago more than the fact that the Giants were the defending Super Bowl champions.
It's kind of crazy. That was back when Brandon Jacobs was good. So that was a long time ago. But
yeah.
Anyway, listen.
Me too.
Thanks for joining us. I'm going to do a little intro for the few people who might not know who you are, if that's okay.
What are the odds?
Exactly. So we're lucky to have Jeremy Schaap today with us. For those of you who don't know, I bet there's probably not too many. Jeremy's one of the most well-recognized ESPN figures, longest tenure, been around the longest, been on some of the most important things that they do. As a little background, he's also a regular contributor to Nightline and ABC World News Tonight. He's published in Sports Illustrated, ESPN The Magazine, Time, Parade, The Wall Street Journal, as well as the New York Times. He's basically covered every single sporting event in the world. I'm not going to read you the list because it's basically every single sporting event, but everything from the Olympics to the World Cup to the Super Bowl to the World Series to tennis, basketball, Final Four. Jeremy's done it all. On top of that, he's author of numerous books, including The Greatest Upset in Boxing History, which is a New York Times bestseller. He's director of 42 to 1, which was an acclaimed 30 for 30 documentary about Buster Douglas when he beat Mike Tyson, which was a huge event. And besides being just an authority in sports, I think what's made Jeremy such a world-renowned figure, it basically is his view on the intersection of sports and society, which is such a critical aspect of our culture. And he's done a great job analyzing that. So I'm really happy to have him here today, joining us talking about American sports and how it's so important for the American society. So again, Jeremy, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Rick.
Well, we'll just start by saying, sports are so popular here in the U.S., even more so than most other civilized countries. Why do you think that is? What leads to the incredible popularity of sports in this country?
Well, we love sports. There's no doubt about that. But I'm not sure if I will, entirely agree with your conceit, because I've been all over the world. I've covered a bunch of World Cups and Olympics and Euros, the world, and that passion for sports is really universal. I'm not sure that we are more passionate here in the United States than we are in other places. We are passionate. I don't know if it rises to a higher level or not. I'll tell you this, having been at a World Cup final in Paris in 1998, when France was playing to win its first World Cup ever on French soil at the Stade de France in Saint-Denis, just outside of Paris. The passion I saw that night in Paris, in terms of the whole country, at least there I saw the whole city, but you can see the whole country wrapped up in that moment. Covering the World Cup in Brazil in 2014, I remember walking through the streets of Sao Paulo when Brazil was playing, and everything was shut down. I mean, everything was shut down in a way that, you don't see in sports events here. Norway, the Winter Olympics in 1994, the passion in that culture, in that country, for cross-country skiing, not something Americans typically get very excited about. Thousands of people lining the course for the big races and all that kind of stuff. Sports is universal. And, it takes different forms to passion in different places. One thing that there have been certainly exceptions to this rule in the U.S., but sometimes the violence we see associated with sports events in other parts of the world is really frightening. And, stories, the hooligan phenomenon, that kind of stuff. Certainly there have been incidents here, but the prevalence of it in some other societies at certain points in time, and it's not really about sports, it's about something else, but it's around sports. So here we love sports. You know, there's certainly the tribal aspect of it. You know, this is our team, this is our town, this is our university that we support. You know, whether you're, you know, a Giants fan or an Ohio State fan, whatever you're a fan of, you know, you grow up with it and it becomes part of your identity in a way. Um, and so there is that, and there's, you know, in a big country like this, obviously with more than 300 million people, something that puts us into these smaller, more manageable groups of loyalties and a shared history. I think there's an attraction there, but sometimes I think we also lose sight of the fact that we love sports because sports are just great. You know, it's fun to watch. The physical nature of what we're seeing, the beauty of that, the impressive nature of it, all of those things, whatever you're watching, whether it's a soccer game or it's gymnastics or, you know, it's track and field, there is beauty in, you know, what we call the cliche poetry in motion, right? And so sports is something, look, as long as there have been people, right, there have been sports. You know, at the very beginning, you know, there were races and feats of strength competitions and wrestling and those kinds of things. And they've developed in various more organized different forms over the millennia. But sport and that desire to compete and to express oneself physically in that way, I think is pretty universal.
Now, you talk about forming that identity. And I think in the U.S., because there's not an overarching, you know, like religion or any kind of ethnic overarching quality, sports, in particular football and baseball, have helped us form that identity. Did you hear that? You there?
I did, yeah. I got the like low power signal on my phone, so like went out for a second, but we're okay. You were saying football and baseball.
Yeah. How have football and baseball helped the U.S. form an identity, whereas other countries have an overarching religion, an overarching culture, overarching ethnicity? In the U.S., it's such a melting pot that sports have definitely helped form an identity for our culture.
Yeah, I think there is truth in that, and I think you know, baseball is the national pastime going back to the mid 19th century. Did that, and sports is a place, where we have seen progress in terms of race relations, the integration of sports, you know, which took a long time, the effect that had on society as a whole. I did a piece recently, Rick, about the significance of a football game that was played just 50 years ago in Birmingham, Alabama, when USC came to Birmingham, came to Legion Field to play Bear Bryant's Crimson Tide, and which was still an all-white team playing on the field that night for Alabama, and a team that was a third African-American from USC coming down there, and especially one player, Sam Cunningham, his excellence in a way forcing change upon Alabama football and SEC football, although other teams had been integrated up to that point. And many people have said over the years, including people I interviewed for this piece, how you know that game changed the landscape in the South in more ways than just in sports. And so sports can bring us together. It can also at times divide us, of course. But sports is both a mirror to and a microcosm of our society. And, you know, we also see through sports, you know, we see immigrant communities in this country integrated into society in a different way, assimilated into society in a different way. When we talk about people coming from Southern Europe or Jews from Eastern Europe, you know, getting into boxing at the turn of the 20th century, and the great fighters who came from the Irish communities and the Italian communities and the Jewish communities and the Slovak communities, on and on. You know, sport was a way to rise up in society. And to assimilate, and your fandom, you know, I come from a family, people, a couple of generations back, all from Brooklyn, right? And some of them all Jewish, but some of them Jews who had been here for generations, some who had just gotten here, but they were all Dodgers fans, and that brought them together, and connected them to people, other people who were Dodgers fans who weren't from their communities necessarily. So there is that element as well, and I think sports is just such a big part of the fabric of our society in so many ways that you can't disconnect it from the larger story. In some ways, it's integral to the story.
Yeah, I mean, and you were talking about change, which is so important, and really pushing the envelope. And I would say that athletes in this country are really such role models. And how important do you think it is that athletes stand up and speak about what they believe in? Racial change, societal change. Having athletes as role models, in my opinion, is critical, and having them voice their opinion, because they have such an avenue to force change.
Well, there's no doubt about it. I mean, I wrote a book about Jesse Owens, and Jesse Owens, is a hero for what he did athletically. Jesse Owens it's not just about what the athletic achievement was, winning 4 gold medals in Berlin in 1936, but against the backdrop, not just competing in Hitler's Berlin in 1936, a few months after the Nuremberg laws go into effect. He was also a second-class citizen here in the United States. And Jesse Owens was one of the first African-American sports heroes that white Americans were rooting for as well. Remember, this is at a time when baseball is segregated, the NFL is segregated. There is no NBA yet. College football is still largely, though not entirely, segregated. Jesse Owens, he makes a difference. Basically through the example of his excellence. But you talk about Jackie Robinson, what he did, the importance of that, and then you get to an activist generation in the '60s, Bill Russell and Muhammad Ali. My dad, so he was born in 1934, and he, the most important figure in sports by far, in the time that he was alive, covering sports in the second half of the 20th century, was Muhammad Ali, and he was very close to Ali. Ali made a difference. He stood for things. You might not have agreed with him, but he stood for things, and he took stands. Many of them, of course, unpopular. Many of them that, eventually he would soften his positions on. But the people that my father admired most of all the people he covered in sports all those decades were probably Muhammad Ali and Arthur Ashe and Billie Jean King, who each, in their own way, stood for much more than excellence as an athlete, but made a difference. And we're seeing over the course of the last several years, I'd say really the last 5 or 6 years, a new era of athlete engagement in larger societal issues, which for a long time, we didn't see as much of, wasn't as prevalent. And it's really obviously accelerated in the last few years. And I wrote a piece, I've been working on a piece the last few days that I guess will air on Election Day, which is about, the incredible engagement from the sports world in this election season and what's been going on. Now, athletes are speaking up, speaking out in ways we've never, I wouldn't say we've never seen before, but in a way we haven't seen in a long time.
Yeah, and I think looking at that, if you want to know how important sports are in this country, I wanted to talk to you about that void that existed during COVID. COVID affected every single aspect of our lives. And there was a several month period where there were no sports in this country, which is something that we've never seen before. How tough was that on this country?
It's hard for me to say. I mean, it was hard. I I remember when the NFL draft came around at the end of April, after, we were kind of like, I guess at that point, late in the second month or midway through the second month of the pandemic here in the US. And having just the NFL draft one night, it felt like a gift, right? Something else to think about, something else to talk about. But of course, it took a while for the games themselves to come back, and it was a weird void. I live in the Northeast. I live in the New York suburbs in Connecticut, and the crisis was so acute here at that time. I'm not, I can't say that like, each night I was thinking to myself, boy, I wish I had an NBA game or an NHL game to watch. But after a while, you just kind of notice like, this is a part of our life. This is something we do all, especially me. I mean, it's our business, the business in which I'm in, the industry in which I'm in. And I have found in my lifetime, whatever personal crisis, personal adversity, what it is, I go back to sports, and I like to watch sports in those moments, and I find comfort in it. And I know that I'm far from the only one.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said is that sports provide a safe haven for a lot of us. It's a way to kind of be distracted amidst all the chaos that's going on with COVID. And you could see that when sports started to come back, and now, we have the NBA, we have NFL, we have college football. There's definitely a rise in the overall attitude of the population. But even with that, there's definitely people who think that sports should not be happening, that the risks of transmitting the virus amongst players, amongst spectators outweighs the benefits. I personally disagree. What's your take on the importance of getting safe sports back here in the U.S. as opposed to continuing a shutdown?
Well, that's it, right? It's about safety. It's about doing it the right way. It's about the right protocols, and hosting these outside line segments that we do. Myself and Ryan Smith as the anchors, 5 days a week on SportsCenter. We talk about these issues constantly and have health experts on constantly. And the question is, where is the line? Where is safety? What constitutes acceptable risk? And a lot of it shifts based on, of course, what is happening with the pandemic, generally speaking. If transmission rates are under control and you're trending in the right direction, it's obviously a very different dynamic, a very different paradigm for, say, sports than if you're in a moment like this where transmission rates are exploding, right? And the Power Five conferences, it's confusing. They're making different decisions. The Pac-12 is saying, no, we're not playing. The SEC is saying we are playing. The Big Ten saying we're not playing, but now we are playing. And, it shifts based on availability. We had, it was an honor a couple of months ago to have on the show one day. I interviewed Harold Varmus, the Nobel Prize winner, who used to run the NIH. And we talked about this, and I asked him, what sport is safe? He says, look, it's shifting. You have to ask yourself, what is acceptable risk? It's different with colleges too, right? Because that's not, they are adults, but they're not being paid. They're not professionals. It's a different dynamic than a professional athlete saying, all right, these are the risks as I know them, and I'm accepting them, and I'm signing off, or I'm opting out, as many have done as well. But anyway, we were talking to Harold Varmus. He's a big tennis guy, and he said, I'm a tennis guy. To me, tennis, seems obviously safer. Golf seems safer. It's about the availability of testing. It's about the seriousness of the protocols being followed. I mean, you saw, what happened in Tennessee with the Titans and the NFL investigation about the protocols. If you're not going to follow the rules, you can't do it, right? And then, we had a piece on a few weeks ago about Alabama football and just how carefully it seemed they were doing everything, and the incredible amount of resources that were being dedicated, which is another question as well, to something like keeping football going. And then Nick Saban tests positive. Now, I don't know if that ended up being, I know that he then tested negative again quickly thereafter. I don't know if it was finally determined that was a false positive. Whatever it is, these are very complicated questions with a million different permutations. And what's clear is, putting people together in an enclosed space, like an arena, that can't be done now. So look what the NHL and the NBA did. They pulled off those bubbles, and the WNBA with remarkable success.
I mean, do you think a bubble, that's obviously not possible in terms of football and the NFL, but do you think, what about college basketball? What about other large sporting events? Should people be pushing for a bubble? It's so difficult to do.
I don't know. I mean, Look, I mean, it's difficult to do, but that's a separate question from whether it's the right thing to do. And we did see it pulled off, in Bradenton and in Orlando and up in Canada and Toronto and Calgary and Edmonton. We're talking about, frankly, a life and death issue. And these are tough questions, and the question is, again, where do we draw the line? What constitutes acceptable risk? What are the things we're going to continue to do and beyond, even through the pandemic? And the experts, the Harold Varmuses and those, and the Anthony Fauci's are the people who have to answer those questions.
Yeah. I mean, like you were saying, safety obviously is the number one priority, but a close second is the economic repercussions of not having sports or having sports pulled back. And that's something that I want to get into.
Big business.
I mean, it's a huge business. Talk about how sports are so intertwined with the U.S. economy overall.
Well, I'm no economist. I don't work for CNBC. I don't, at my fingertips, I don't have those numbers, Rick, which is no surprise to you. But it is, it's in terms of the overall economy, GDP, I don't know. But in terms of, you go to a town, you go someplace like College Station, Texas, in football season, I know what the impact is when you don't have football. You go to Lincoln, Nebraska, football season. It's not just about the people working in the athletic department, although there have been big cuts in these athletic departments as well. It's about the local community too, the restaurant owners, the bar owners, the hotel owners, but these are all considerations, and these are real lives being affected. And so that's why the calculus, of course, is so complicated when you're making these decisions.
Yeah. And, staying with the economic issue, I mean, athletes make an insane amount of money, at least the top ones do. So, for example, Pat Mahomes, arguably the best quarterback in football, just signed the largest contract in history, $500 million.
Worth every cent. He's worth every cent.
No, exactly. So I want to talk to you about that because a lot of people have an issue with that. They want to know, how does a quarterback make so much money when doctors or lawyers or teachers or scientists make a fraction of that? Now, listen, I mean, I'm on your side. I think he's worth every single penny, but just give me your take. How do you explain that discrepancy where a quarterback makes $500 million and a teacher makes, less than 100,000?
Well, I can explain it. I'm not going to justify it, but
okay.
It's easily explained. It's supply and demand, right? I mean, that's the way, that's why Tom Cruise gets $20 million per movie, right? That's why Alex Rodriguez signed a contract for $252 million 20 years ago, because there was someone willing to pay it. And because the economic calculations that were made behind that decision, the ownership, in that case, we're getting to specifics. Tom Hicks of the Texas Rangers said, "I'm gonna make more money off of. I'm gonna create profit from paying Alex Rodriguez this much money." It's a huge pool of money, and it keeps getting bigger. And in some ways, sports properties, the big ones, keep getting more valuable in our kind of splintered mass culture, right? Because sports are some of the last big tent events where you can draw people in. You can get tens of millions of people watching. Ratings obviously have been down in some sports this fall, and we could argue about the reasons. I'm not, there are a lot of different explanations, interest in the election, obviously the pandemic, too much competition, different sports taking place at the same time. But sports are still some of the few reliable mass culture events, right? And that's what it's about. So there are TV dollars, and then there are, stadium experience dollars, and trust me, they're paying these huge contracts, right? In the big sports, the owners aren't going broke, right? And for a long time, remember, before the advent of free agency, let's say in the mid 1970s, essentially with the ruling in baseball after Curt Flood challenged the system and was defeated at the Supreme Court, and then I think it was Peter Seitz was the arbitrator who ruled in favor of Messersmith and McNally, ushering in the age of free agency. Suddenly the playing field after 100 years was level, or getting more level. But for 100 years, players had no leverage in all these sports, and they were mostly terrifically underpaid. I'm not Adam Smith, but it's market demand, right?
Yeah, so it's just simple numbers. Basically, if people were paying X amount of dollars to watch a scientist or a doctor or a teacher, that would end up being more reimbursement. And so it's a strictly numbers
Should we
game.
find a better way to, of course, I mean, again, I'm not an economist. I don't know, how you'd have to change tax policy or anything like that. But should people who do these essential jobs get a bigger share of the American pie? I'm all in favor of that.
Yeah.
But I understand why sports stars, why Patrick Mahomes gets, that big deal, why Aaron Rodgers is making $29 million a year, whatever it is. It's because they're making that money back for their entities and then some.
Yeah, it's strictly supply and demand, just like you said. Wrapping up here, I just wanted to talk a little bit about non-professionals. So they've done a lot of studies looking at the involvement in sports in kids, young adults, even kind of middle-aged. And people who play sports are in general healthier, less drugs, better education, better jobs. In every single respect, people who played sports are more successful and have better outcomes than people who don't play sports in general.
You mean when they were kids or as they continue through adult life?
I'm sorry?
You mean they played sports when they were kids, or they continue to play through adult life?
So they started, so it can be at really any level. They've looked at kids playing sports,
Yeah, I had a doctor who did a big study about that at UVM, and how the remarkable correlation, what you're talking about, between positive outcomes and participation in sports. And it seems, it seems clear.
And how do we as a country increase participation in sports? It's very clear that sports are correlated with just more positive outcomes in every respect, no matter what the age group. How do we increase, participation in sports at every level here?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we have to find a way. And my friend Tom Ferry, who works on these issues at the Aspen Institute, he would know more about this, about how we increase access, right? Because, I live in an affluent suburb in Connecticut, and I see how expensive it is and how few people can afford to, sign up their kids for this or that. Some of these sports are so expensive, and it requires resources. And meanwhile, schools are cutting back. Schools, are underfunded, especially for their programs for recess and sports and all that stuff. I mean, it's a question of prioritizing resources, right? I mean, we keep coming back to money. What do we value? What are we going to pay for as a society? What are we going to, take from to give to? And to me, again, I'm not an expert on it, following youth sports, but I do know that we have to do a better job of emphasizing it, making it available to kids, having, PE programs that are more expansive, and at the same time, not professionalizing sports at such a young age that we see in so many places in the world, and turning kids who would play everything into one sport athletes because they want to get a scholarship in 10 years. I understand the motivation, especially when college expenses are so great, but the specialization, I think, is to the detriment of a lot of kids, and I think there has to be more joy in it, more just playing.
Yeah. Well, listen, Jeremy, I could talk sports, and particularly sports, with you pretty much all day. But I know you got other stuff to do, and you're super busy. I just want to say thank you for all you do, mainly tackling all the tough issues in sports. You know, it's easy to talk about who won the Super Bowl, much tougher to talk about all of the society issues that sports brings with it. And you do an amazing job of that. So thank you for everything you do. You know, keep up the great work. And it was great catching up with you, man. It's been a while.
It's great seeing you, Rick. And I should say, I appreciate the work you do. It's much more important than the work that I do. Thank you.
Well, it's all relative. And again, thanks again. Have a great Friday. And it was a pleasure catching up.
Great seeing you, sir.
All right, buddy. Take care.
Bye-bye.